Today's gospel reading comes from Matthew 22:34 through 46. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and all the prophets." Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
It's a funny thing that what money does to people. A lot of people try to spend their money and try to get as many materialistic things that they can. They try to fill up their life with things outside of what truly fills up your life. Have you ever heard the saying that money cannot buy you happiness? It's true, right? Money can buy you a lot of things. It can buy you that brand new sports car. It can buy you the clothes on your back. It can buy you memories and adventures across the world. But money cannot buy you happiness. It cannot buy you laughter. It cannot buy you love. According to Paul in Corinthians, the greatest of these is love. How often do we forget that money cannot buy us love? How often do we focus in on filling our life with so many other things to make ourselves happy? But deep down, all we need is love. We're focused on the materialistic things, and we forget something so simple as love. This was true during the time of Moses. It was true during the time of Jesus. It was true during the time of Paul. And it is still true now during our time. We forget the word and the feeling of love. So then, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus asked the Pharisees and the Sadducees this simple thing. And they came back with 1,000 different answers, but Jesus pinpointed them down and saying from Deuteronomy 6:5, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." But Jesus changed it to love your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest commandment. It's not the first commandment. It's not the last commandment. The first commandment being, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other God before me." The last being, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife," and so on and so forth. After the second commandments are given out, Moses adds this commandment, the greatest commandment, of love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. The difference between Matthew's version and the version in Deuteronomy is that might versus mind. It still says love. It still says love the Lord your God. So why does Jesus switch it to mind? What I want to examine with you here today is what that word mind does with the word love. How does love impact your mind and your thoughts and your outwardly emotions, your body, the way that you act with other people. Yesterday, my family and I watched The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. And if you have seen that movie, it's a movie about Halloween. It's a movie about friends coming together and going trick-or-treating, about the celebration. And ultimately, Linus sits in the pumpkin patch throughout the night and skips all of the celebratory offerings and waits for that great pumpkin to show up. But what happens with Charlie Brown when he shows up to go trick-or-treating is the first thing that he says is, I had a problem with the scissors and my holes are cut wrong. The ghost costume that he had holes throughout it, and it doesn't really look like the typical costume that he wanted. So Charlie Brown's mind immediately was negative. He immediately said, I did something wrong, and he didn't love himself or love the costume that he had. So what happens the rest of the movie? Charlie Brown goes trick-or-treating, and while everybody else gets lollipops and candy bars, he's given a rock. Each and every house, he's given another rock. Charlie Brown doesn't think about the positives and the happiness that comes, but he only thinks about that rock that he has in his sack. He doesn't think about the love that he has of his friends that go trick-or-treating with him. He thinks about that rock. At the end of the movie, he curses up a storm, saying, I have the sack of rocks, and everybody else is eating their suckers, and they're at the party having a good time. But Charlie Brown is down. Charlie Brown's mental process is only focused on the negativity. Little does he know that he set this pattern in place by thinking about it and thinking about all the negative aspects of his life and not thinking about those people around him. It's funny what happens when your mind gets focused in on the negative parts and you don't focus in on the good things that are around you. You don't focus in on the congregation, the great people that are in this room. You don't focus in on your family that is there to support you. You don't focus in on the people that wake up next to you and tell you that they love you. That phone call that you get from your kids, your grandkids, your mother, your father, your friends, that say, I love you and I'm thinking about you. Charlie Brown didn't love himself during this moment. He thought of himself very negatively and thought of himself as a failure because he couldn't get that costume working right. But it's funny that if he would have just changed his mindset just a little bit, he could have thought about all the positives that came about from that night. He spent a night trick-or-treating with his friends. He celebrated with his friends that night. How often are we like Charlie Brown, stuck on the negativity in our lives? Stuck in this mindset that only allows us to be limited on our viewpoints, constantly filling our heads with negative thoughts and negative actions. Jesus calls the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. If our mind is focused in on negativity, how can we love the Lord our God with all of it? How can we give praise to our Lord for everything that is positive in our lives? How can we be in a deep relationship with God if we are only focused in on the negative aspects? The greatest commandment which Jesus refers to was a verse that was often talked about within the temple and within the daily lives of the Israelites. However, they didn't fully understand it, didn't fully grasp it, didn't fully recognize the impact that this verse had. They were like Charlie Brown, constantly yelling at God, telling him, I want more. I want the temple to look this way. I want people to respect me this way. They had gotten so wrapped around the politics and the bureaucracy of the system that they were only focused in on themselves and not on the actual worship of God. Never once did they open their hearts and thank God for what they had. Did they thank God for the miracles that this man, Jesus, was doing amongst the people? Did they thank God for John the Baptist, who spread the word just was able to provide and bring so many people back into the church. We know this is true because the Sadducees focused in on plots and means in order to kill Jesus. We know this is still true because this cross is behind me today, a symbol of our faith, a symbol that Jesus gave himself for us. What are we willing to give back? What are we willing to do to focus our lives back in on God and back in on Jesus? To reset our mindset, to love the Lord our God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all your mind. They lost the importance of love within their lives. As we often do, we often get focused in on everything else besides love. So what does it mean to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind? To me, I think about this when I start thinking about filling my mind with things, filling my life with things. You can turn on the TV and watch an action movie or show that shows murder and a lot of crime. You can turn on the radio and listen to songs that are focused in on swear words and cussing. You can turn on the computer and be able to go to an array of websites that have anything but a focus in on love. In other words, we fill our minds with junk. We fill our body and our soul with junk. If we're filling ourselves with junk, how can we outwardly portray love and outwardly portray a lifestyle of happiness? Without answering this question, how many of us throughout this week spend a moment of prayer or a moment of silence building our relationship with God every day? How about half the days of the week? How about a single day? God calls us to be in a relationship. He calls us to communicate with him. Yet we fill ourselves with so many other things that the first thing to go is that communication with God. To be in connection with him with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind takes a deep commitment. One that gets distracted, that often goes when we get distracted by football games, sporting events, family events, or whatever else fills our time in our lives. I'll admit it, I'm that way. This week I moved from Texas up here to Minnesota. We got in on Monday and our household goods arrived on Tuesday. So instead of spending that morning hour or 2 hours that I normally try to give to God, I spent it unpacking, or I spent it doing this or that, trying to organize the house. We all have things that take away from our relationship. But the thing that I always came back to at the end of the day when I did give up that time was as I reflected in on the day, I was either more irritable, more angry, more hostile, more whatever. My focus was not in on the positives of my life. It was more focused in on everything that was going on bad. I was like Charlie Brown. I was focused in on the negative and the bad aspects of my life. How easy it is just to switch our mindset and look at the positive aspects, to look at the joys and the happiness that can come through a deep relationship with God. By filling our lives with love, by filling our lives with happiness, by filling our lives with joy, we are able to outwardly portray that to the people around us. We're able to portray that to God through our relationship. And we are able to just be better people. We heard this week on the news coming out of Washington that there was another school shooting. It seems like a routine thing that keeps happening week after week, month after month. I do not know specifically the instances or the issues that happened there, but this got me thinking as I was preparing for this sermon of what would have happened if that boy that day was told by somebody random that they love him, that they care for him, or that he's a good person. I don't know if this happened or not, but what type of an impact would that have? How often do we immediately judge or immediately jump to conclusions instead of telling somebody, I love you, thank you, you're a good friend? Would he have second-guessed his actions that morning? Would he have thought differently about himself entering that school that day? I know personally that if my wife tells me I love, or that she loves me, my mindset is immediately changed. I immediately start thinking about the joys and the happiness within my family. I immediately start thinking about all the goodness that comes. So what would have happened that day if he would have been told by somebody random, you're a good person, I love you, thank you? That outwardly portrayal of God's love. God calls us all to portray that each and every day. So while the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, it's also love yourself, love your neighbor, love your parents, your kids, your friends. Love the world and show the world that you love them. God wants us to be in this relationship. God calls us to love unconditionally with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind.